Why did they laugh? That was the question that kept circling in her head as the plates clattered and the smell of pot roast clung to the walls like smoke. Jenna Walker had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. She pictured her father pausing mid-bite, setting down his fork, pride softening the lines carved deep into his face. She had imagined her brothers, soldiers through and through, leaning back with approving nods, maybe even a rare good for you. But reality wasn't kind enough to follow the script. They laughed. Not the polite kind that fades after a second, but the rolling, chest-deep laughter that tells you someone doesn't believe a word you're saying. Her father didn't even stop chewing. Her brothers exchanged glances like they'd just heard the setup to a joke. And Jenna, sitting there with her hands folded neatly in her lap, felt something small and fragile crack deep inside her chest. "I'm joining the army," she repeated, quieter this time as if volume had been the problem. But it was belief. They didn't have any. "Intelligence branch," she added. "Strategic analysis, not combat." That's when her father finally reacted, not with surprise or support, but with a low, dismissive chuckle. "You won't last a week," he said, and just like that, the conversation ended. He turned back to his plate, carving another piece of meat as if she hadn't just set her future on the table between them. The room was suddenly too small, the air too thick. Her brothers went back to swapping stories about barracks life and drill sergeants. Her father started talking about some training exercise he'd run 20 years ago. None of them asked a single question. None of them cared. Except for her mother. "Strength isn't always loud," she said softly, her eyes cutting through the noise. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep Jenna from breaking right there at the table. She held onto those words like a lifeline, repeating them silently until the end of dinner. And later that night, lying on her bed staring at the ceiling fan, she whispered them again, this time as a promise. Strength isn't always loud. She had already filled out the forms. She had already written the personal statement, every word sharp and deliberate. She'd even researched the intake dates and prepared a study plan for the aptitude tests. The decision had been made weeks ago, but some part of her, the naive part that still believed fathers were supposed to see their daughters, had wanted to tell him first, had wanted him to be proud. But pride was for her brothers. Pride came in the form of knives and boots on birthdays, in stories told at the VFW about my boys. Pride wasn't for daughters who solved puzzles and memorized rivers instead of firing guns. That night Jenna didn't cry. She didn't rage or scream. She just stared at the ceiling and let the silence harden into resolve. If he couldn't see her strength, she'd build it somewhere he couldn't ignore. Not to earn his approval, that was a losing battle, but to prove, if only to herself, that she could survive on her own terms. Basic training was less of a shock and more of a slow, grinding erosion of everything she thought she knew. The first week wasn't about physical strength or endurance. It was about judgment. The way people looked at you the moment you stepped off the bus. The way they decided who you were before you'd even said a word. Most of the recruits had something to prove. They shouted the loudest, ran the fastest, flexed in the mirrors like they were auditioning for a role. Jenna didn't bother. She wasn't there to impress anyone. She was there to endure. She wasn't the fastest, not even close. On the first timed run, she came in near the back, lungs burning, legs screaming. Her upper body strength was mediocre. Her first attempt at the obstacle course was a disaster, and handling a weapon. Let's just say the drill sergeant stopped shouting long enough to ask if she'd ever seen a rifle before. But where she lacked brute strength, she excelled at something else: observation. Every night, while the others collapsed into their bunks, Jenna pulled out a small notebook and started writing. Every mistake, every correction, every tiny piece of feedback, she logged it all. She noted which commands tripped people up, which routines wasted time, what order to lace boots to shave off seconds in the morning. She even calculated how early she needed to wake up to avoid the bathroom line. By week 2, they had a nickname for her, Clipboard Girl. It wasn't a compliment. It was a way of saying she didn't belong, that she was too soft, too methodical, too different. but names only sting when they're wrong. Jenna taped the latest checklist to the inside of her locker and kept going. The first time her lists proved useful came during a surprise inspection. The ones who had mocked her the loudest failed spectacularly: messy bunks, misplaced gear, weapons out of regulation. Jenna's area, not perfect but close, tight, precise, enough to draw a rare nod from the drill sergeant. The next day, 2 recruits quietly asked if they could copy her checklist. A week later, a third joined them. And just like that, Clipboard Girl became less of a joke and more of a resource. She didn't gloat. She didn't remind them how they'd laughed. She just handed over the notes and went back to work, because it wasn't about being liked. It was about surviving. The field exercise came 3 weeks later. On paper, the mission was straightforward: navigate rugged terrain, breach a simulated compound, and exfiltrate before sundown. But there was a catch. The maps they were given were deliberately outdated, full of discrepancies and deliberate traps. Most squads took the obvious route, the wide, cleared path that cut straight toward the objective. Jenna's team did too at first, but then something nagged at her. A small detail on the map didn't match the terrain. A cluster of trees that shouldn't have been there. A drainage pattern that flowed the wrong way. "Something off," she said, pulling out a folded sheet of paper. It was a satellite overlay she'd studied 2 nights earlier just for fun. Except now it didn't feel like fun. It felt like survival. "We should veer east," she suggested. Her squad leader frowned. "Objective west." "I know," she said, "but look at the drainage lines. The terrain shifts here. If we follow the main route, we'll be funneled into a low-lying area, perfect place for a simulated minefield." They argued, of course. Nobody wanted to take orders from Clipboard Girl. But in the end, the squad leader sighed and gave the order. They shifted east, weaving through the denser brush and climbing over uneven ground. An hour later, the radio crackled with news. Another team had triggered a simulated minefield on the main route. Their mission was over. Jenna's team kept moving. Back at base, the instructors wanted to know how they'd avoided the trap. Jenna handed over her notes. The lead sergeant stared at her for a long moment before asking, "You saw that before it happened?" She nodded. That's when things changed. The joke slowed. The whispers shifted. They started calling her the ghost with the maps. It wasn't official, but it stuck. And soon, the same recruits who once ignored her started showing up at her bunk with questions. "How do you read satellite overlays? How do you calculate likely choke points? Can you teach me?" She taught them quietly, without fanfare, because strength wasn't about shouting. It was about seeing what others didn't and acting before it was too late. Months later, Jenna's reputation had grown beyond the training ground. She wasn't the loudest or the fastest, but when something looked off, people asked for her opinion. If they had a gut feeling, they brought her the data to back it up. And more often than not, her instincts were right. Her tools weren't rifles or explosives. They were patterns, movement logs, threat grids, weather models. She didn't fire shots, she prevented ambushes. She didn't break doors, she mapped escape routes before anyone needed them. And slowly, people began to realize that her kind of strength, the quiet, meticulous kind, was the difference between a mission success and a body bag. One day, a SEAL commander she'd worked with pulled her aside after a debrief. "If she says it's dangerous," he told his team, "I believe it." That was all he said. But in the world Jenna operated in, that kind of trust was worth more than any medal. But back home, nothing had changed. When her brothers visited, her father would line up beers and talk about raids and firefights. He'd introduce them to his friends as "my boys, both Army strong." "And Jenna, she helps out with the paperwork," he'd say, dismissing her years of intelligence work as if she were filing reports instead of saving lives. It stung more than she wanted to admit. Once, he introduced her at a church event as "my daughter who does admin work." She spent the previous 3 weeks building an intelligence map that prevented a team from walking into an ambush. But apparently, that was just admin work. She didn't correct him. What was the point? His version of strength was loud, visible. It came with scars and medals. Hers was silent, invisible, and he couldn't see it. Maybe he never would. But her mother understood. She always had. She never asked for details. She just wanted to know if Jenna was eating, sleeping, staying safe. And when she got sick, Jenna was the one who came home, who rearranged schedules around treatments, who held her hand through the worst of it. Her brothers stopped by for a weekend or two. Jenna stayed. The night before her mother passed, she whispered something that Jenna would never forget. "You protect people," she said, "without making noise about it." That was who Jenna Walker was. And though the world might never applaud her for it, though even her father might never understand, she knew one thing for certain. Strength isn't always loud. It's quiet, patient, steady, and it keeps people alive. How do you measure strength when no one is watching? It was a question Jenna asked herself often in the long, fluorescent-lit hallways of intelligence buildings, in the quiet hum of server rooms, in the endless scroll of satellite feeds that blurred days into nights. Out there, strength was loud. It roared through gunfire and shouted commands. But here, behind the glow of a monitor, it was silent. And in that silence, Jenna thrived. Her first assignment wasn't glamorous. Most new analysts cut their teeth on logistics, convoy schedules, supply routes, routine patrol maps. It was work few cared about until something went wrong. But Jenna approached it the same way she approached everything, with relentless precision. She cross-referenced weather patterns with road conditions, checked every satellite image twice, and flagged even the smallest inconsistencies. 2 weeks in, one of her flagged routes was reassigned to a new patrol path. The change wasn't big, a 3-mile detour to avoid a low-visibility valley. Most of the team didn't even notice. But days later, insurgents ambushed the original route. A convoy that might have been there was. Lives that could have been lost weren't. No one credited her. The report just said, "Analysis update." But Jenna didn't care. For the first time, she understood what it meant to matter without anyone knowing your name. The longer she worked, the deeper into the machinery she went. She learned to read more than maps, to read people. Patterns in radio chatter, subtle shifts in intercepted calls, changes in supply movements that hinted at something larger. Intelligence work was part science, part intuition, and Jenna's intuition was sharper than most. It was during a standard operations briefing that she first noticed it. A string of supply trucks moving too often through a stretch of desert that supposedly had no active cells. On paper, it looked routine. In reality, it didn't make sense. She ran the numbers 3 times, traced the routes, then mapped out possible outcomes. The picture forming in her head wasn't good. When she presented her findings to the senior analyst, he barely looked up from his coffee. "Probably just resupply," he said. "Maybe," Jenna replied carefully. "But if it's not, we're ignoring a potential staging ground." "Not our concern unless command flags it," he said, already moving on. Jenna stared at the data long after the meeting ended. Something in her gut refused to let it go. So she did what she always did. She built a plan. Cross-referenced the convoys with satellite imagery, tracked fuel usage, even listened to snippets of intercepted chatter late into the night. And slowly, a pattern emerged, a pattern that pointed to something far more dangerous than a supply run. 3 weeks later, her report landed on the desk of a field commander. 48 hours after that, a special operations unit raided a hidden cache site in the very location Jenna had flagged. They seized weapons, comms equipment, and intel linking the network to a planned attack. The debrief was short. "Good work," her supervisor said, but the way he looked at her was different now, like maybe her instincts weren't something to dismiss. Still, not everyone respected what she did. The culture of the military had always rewarded visibility, the soldiers on the ground, the ones who kicked down doors and returned with scars. Analysts, they were support. Necessary, sure, but not heroic. Jenna heard the whispers when she passed in the hallway. "Desk jockey, map girl, the one who never leaves the base. They weren't malicious, not really, just ignorant, and maybe she thought they were right. She wasn't the one pulling the trigger. She wasn't the one bleeding in the dirt. Her job was to see, to anticipate, but sometimes seeing didn't feel like enough. That doubt followed her everywhere. It echoed in the back of her mind during briefings, clung to her when she walked past walls lined with medals. But every time it started to crush her, she remembered the convoy that never drove into an ambush, the cash that never reached enemy hands, the families that would never receive folded flags. She wasn't there to be seen. She was there to make sure others came home. It was late spring when the operation that would define her career began to take shape. A network of insurgent cells had been slipping across borders, leaving a trail of improvised devices and dead patrols in their wake. They were ghosts, coordinated, careful, and always one step ahead. For weeks, analysts had tried to track them. Satellite sweeps, drone reconnaissance, human intelligence, nothing stuck. They moved too fast, too unpredictably, but Jenna noticed something everyone else had missed. "They're not unpredictable," she said during the team briefing. "They're patterned." The room went quiet. Senior analysts exchanged glances. "Patterned how?" one asked. "They're moving in cycles," Jenna explained. "Not geographical, logistical. They hit supply routes based on fuel shipments, not troop movement. They're watching fuel convoys. Every time we reroute them, the cells reposition." Skepticism buzzed through the room. "You're basing this on 3 incidents," someone said. "5," she corrected, "and I can predict the next 2. There was a pause, then a slow nod from the operations chief. "Show us." Jenna spent the next 48 hours building a predictive model, layering data from convoy manifests, border activity, and intercepted communications. The result was clear. Within 10 days, the insurgents would strike a fuel convoy near a remote pass, a place no one had considered vulnerable. It was a gamble, but command authorized a trap, a decoy convoy, light on personnel, heavy on surveillance. And just as Jenna had predicted, they came. The ambush unfolded almost exactly as she'd mapped it down to the minute. This time, though, the enemy walked into a net. The operation was a success. Dozens of key figures were captured, supply lines were disrupted, and the network, once invisible, was suddenly scrambling. It was the first time Jenna's name appeared in a commendation memo. Just a line, analysis by Specialist Walker contributed to mission success. But it was there. And for the first time, she felt something dangerously close to pride. The recognition was fleeting. Back home, things were as they'd always been. Her father still told stories about his boys. At church gatherings, he still introduced her as the one who works at a desk. Once, he even joked that her job was basically Google with a badge. People laughed. Jenna smiled. And when she went home that night, she stared at the commendation letter pinned to her wall and wondered why it still wasn't enough. But some part of her, the part that had hardened the night they laughed at her dream, knew it never would be. His approval wasn't the goal anymore. The work was. The work, though, came with a cost. After 2 years of deployments, Jenna had learned to live with the constant hum of tension, the knowledge that one missed signal, one misread pattern could mean disaster. It was a pressure that seeped into every part of her life. Sleep came rarely. Relationships never lasted. And on the nights when the silence grew too heavy, she'd find herself in the operations room long after her shift ended, watching live drone feeds of places she'd never set foot in. She told herself it was part of the job, that she was just being thorough, but deep down she knew the truth. It wasn't about thoroughness. It was about responsibility. Every life out there weighed on her, every soldier, every convoy, every civilian caught in the crossfire. And if she stopped watching, even for a second, she might miss something that mattered. "Walker," her supervisor said one night, finding her hunched over a bank of screens at 200. "Go home." "I'm fine," she said, though her eyes burned and her hands trembled slightly from too much caffeine. "You're not," he said, and you're no good to anyone if you burn out. She didn't argue, but she didn't leave either. It was around that time that she got the message. Not an order, not an assignment, just 2 words on a secure line: need you. It came from a team leader she'd worked with months earlier, a man whose unit had avoided an ambush thanks to one of her reports. They were heading into a high-risk zone, deep in hostile territory, and they wanted her on the mission planning team. Jenna hesitated. This wasn't standard. Analysts rarely worked that closely with field units. But the request was clear: they trusted her. They needed her. The next 3 weeks were a blur of planning sessions and late-night briefings. Jenna pored over every scrap of intelligence, cross-checked every map, built contingency plans for scenarios no one else had considered. She didn't sleep more than 3 hours a night. But when the team deployed, their confidence was unshakable. If she says it's dangerous, the commander told them before wheels up, we believe it. Jenna watched them board the transport with a knot in her chest. She wouldn't be with them on the ground. She never was. But in a way, a part of her always went with them, tucked into the folds of their mission packets, hidden in the coordinates scribbled on their maps. The mission was a success. They breached, extracted, and returned with minimal casualties. And in the debrief, the commander said just one thing: her plan saved lives. It wasn't a medal, it wasn't a speech, but it was enough. Later, alone in her quarters, Jenna stared at the reflection in the darkened window. She was exhausted, drained. But beneath the fatigue, there was something else, something steadier, deeper. This was why she did it. Not for the recognition, not for the approval she'd never get, but for the knock on the door at 2 a.m., for the need you message from a team miles away, for the knowledge that somewhere out there, someone was still breathing because she'd seen what others hadn't. She didn't need applause. She didn't need to be loud. She just needed to keep watching. Strength wasn't in the noise. It was in the silence between decisions. And that silence, heavy, patient, relentless, was where Jenna Walker lived. How much of someone's life is decided by the things they don't say? It was a question Jenna couldn't shake as she sat alone in the dim glow of the ops center at 300, the hum of servers filling the silence. Across the room, a row of screens showed heat signatures crawling slowly across a mountainside half a world away, a reconnaissance team inching toward a suspected weapons cache. To most people, it was just a blinking red dot. To Jenna, it was 5 beating hearts, each one trusting her analysis more than their own instincts. Her father would have called them warriors. He would have told stories about the men on that screen, the dirt under their boots, the adrenaline, the courage. He wouldn't mention the woman sitting in a dark room on another continent, her eyes scanning for the slightest anomaly, her breath catching every time one of those red dots hesitated. She was used to being invisible, but lately, invisibility felt heavier. The recon team paused near a ridge too long, too still. Jenna leaned forward, scanning the feed. The terrain looked off. Patterns didn't match the topo data she'd memorized. A subtle shift in the shadow line, an unnatural curve in the sand. She checked the timestamp, ran the imagery back 6 hours, then 12. There it was, a slight difference in ground texture, the kind you only saw when something had been buried. Team Bravo, adjust route, she said into the comms. Marker Echo 2 is compromised. A pause, then a voice crackled back. Copy that, what are you seeing? Probable IED, unstable ground, reroute 20 meters north. Another pause, you sure? Jenna's heart thudded. She hated that question not because they doubted her, but because it meant they were weighing her word against their survival. I'm sure, she said. Move north. They followed, and 30 seconds later, the ground where they'd been standing erupted in a plume of dirt and smoke. A delayed detonation, likely remote triggered, missed by less than half a minute. Jesus, one of them breathed. Walker, you just saved our asses. She exhaled, slow and controlled. Stay focused, she replied. You're not home yet. The mission ended without casualties. Another quiet success. Another story that would never make headlines. But Jenna didn't need headlines. She just needed them to come home. It was becoming a pattern, one she didn't mind. Analysts like her rarely made field decisions, but Jenna had earned the trust of multiple units. They started requesting her by name. "If Walker's on the desk, we'll go," one commander said during a planning session. It wasn't meant for her to hear, but she did. And it stuck. Still, the weight of that trust came with a darker side. One afternoon, she was reviewing drone footage from a remote village when she saw it, a cluster of figures gathering near a supply route days before a scheduled patrol. The behavior didn't fit the usual pattern of civilian movement. She flagged it immediately, recommended delaying the patrol, and built a case for increased surveillance. The decision was kicked up the chain, and somewhere between her report and command approval it was overruled. "No credible threat," the field officer wrote. "Proceed as planned." She argued. She sent follow-up data. She called in favors. Nothing changed. The patrol launched. 2 days later, the lead vehicle hit an explosive device. 3 soldiers were killed. Jenna read the after-action report in silence. Her hands shook so badly she almost dropped the tablet. The IED was within 30 meters of where she'd marked the suspicious activity. 30 meters. For the first time in her career, she couldn't breathe. She replayed the footage over and over, searching for something she missed, a detail, a clue, a reason. But there was nothing. She'd seen it. She warned them. And they'd ignored her. And now, 3 families would get folded flags. Guilt was a strange thing. It didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, like water under a locked door, until one day you were drowning in it. Jenna started questioning everything, every instinct, every analysis. Was she really as good as they thought? Had she gotten lucky before? Was her confidence arrogance? She stopped sleeping, stopped eating much too. Nights bled into mornings, mornings into nights. She buried herself in data, staying hours past her shift. Colleagues started to notice. A friend in her unit, Morales, tried to intervene. "You can't own every decision," he said gently. "They died," Jenna whispered, "and I saw it coming. Command ignored your warning. That's not on you." But it felt like it was. It felt like it always would be. The weeks that followed tested her in ways basic training never had. The missions kept coming. The data kept flowing. And each time she opened a new file, a voice in the back of her mind whispered, "What if you're wrong this time? What if someone else dies?" Doubt became her constant companion, and doubt was dangerous. During one particularly tense operation, a strike team requested her analysis on a suspected safe house. Satellite imagery was inconclusive. Signals intel suggested high-value targets were inside, but something about the heat signature pattern didn't sit right with her. It was too steady, too evenly distributed, not the chaotic movement of armed fighters. "Recommend holding off," she said, hesitating. "Possibly non-combatants inside." The commander on the other end sounded impatient. "We don't get a second shot at this, Walker." "I understand," she said, "but I need confirmation before I greenlight." It took 6 more hours of cross-referencing and analysis before she was certain. The safe house wasn't a safe house at all. It was a medical clinic. The signals intel had been spoofed. If she'd given the go-ahead, they would have hit a civilian target. That night she sat alone in the empty briefing room, staring at the mission log. She was shaking again, but this time not from guilt, from relief. She'd been right to trust herself. The doubt didn't disappear, but something shifted. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about refusing to stop trying, even when the world ignored you. By her 3rd year in, Jenna had become indispensable. Teams rotated out, commanders retired, analysts moved on, but she remained. Quiet, consistent, steady. Her maps weren't just maps anymore. They were gospel. Her risk assessments weren't suggestions. They were doctrine. She still wasn't the face anyone saw in a mission photo, but her fingerprints were on nearly every successful op in the region. And yet, when she flew home for her mother's memorial service, none of that mattered. Her father still introduced her as the daughter who helps out at the desk. Her brothers still dominated the conversations with stories of firefights and field promotions. And when an old family friend asked if she'd ever thought about doing something real, she just smiled and said she was happy where she was. But something inside her cracked a little deeper that night. She'd spent years saving lives, anticipating threats, preventing disasters. And still, in the eyes of the people who were supposed to know her best, she was invisible. It would have been easy to become bitter, easy to snap, to scream, to list every life her work had touched. But Jenna had learned something far more powerful than anger. Silence could be a weapon, too. The call came 2 weeks later. A black file operation. High risk, high secrecy, limited personnel. The kind of mission that never made the news and officially didn't exist. And they wanted Jenna. The briefing was sparse. A high-value target was suspected of orchestrating coordinated attacks across 3 regions, capture or neutralize. The target was paranoid, mobile, always 2 steps ahead. The only way to find him was to predict his next move. Jenna dove into the data. She studied everything: travel patterns, intercepted emails, encrypted phone calls, even grocery deliveries to suspected safe houses. She mapped it all, building a profile piece by piece. And slowly, a pattern emerged. He wasn't moving randomly. He was moving in a spiral, tightening circles around a central point. And that point was a remote valley near the border, a place long considered inactive. She presented her analysis. He'll be there in 7 days. 7 days, the mission commander asked. We don't have confirmation he's even in the country. You will, Jenna said, because he's not hiding, he's circling. It was a gamble. If she was wrong, the mission would fail. But if she was right, they'd end a campaign of terror that had lasted nearly a decade. 7 days later, the target arrived, exactly where she said he would, exactly when. The operation was swift and surgical. No casualties, objective achieved. And still, in the official report, her name was a footnote. Analysis support provided by Specialist Walker, nothing more. But this time it didn't sting. She knew who she was now. She knew what she was capable of. And she knew that somewhere out there, families were safe, cities were sleeping peacefully, and soldiers were coming home because of work no one would ever see. One night long after the op, Jenna was locking up the situation room when she heard footsteps behind her. It was the mission commander, a man with 30 years of field experience, a chest full of ribbons, and a reputation for never wasting words. You ever think about why they call you the last quiet leader? He asked. She blinked. I didn't know they did. They do, he said, because you laid without needing to be seen, because people follow plans they don't even know you wrote, because you make us better and half the time we don't even realize it. Jenna didn't know what to say. You don't need medals for that, he continued. Hell, half the people who get medals wouldn't have survived without you. When he left, Jenna stood in the empty hallway for a long time, the hum of the base around her. She thought about her father, about the laughter at that dinner table years ago. She thought about the guilt, the sleepless nights, the endless doubt. And she thought about the lives still breathing, because of a decision she made in silence. Maybe strength wasn't about who shouted the loudest. Maybe it was about who kept showing up, even when no one clapped. What happens when the mission you believe in starts to feel wrong? That was the question that haunted Jenna long before anyone said it aloud. Long before the briefings grew tense, and the silence in the room felt heavier than the classified files stacked on the table. It crept in quietly, a flicker of doubt in the corner of her mind, and no matter how much she tried to ignore it, it stayed. It started with an operation codenamed Iron Vein, a cross-border campaign designed to disrupt a weapons network feeding insurgent cells. On paper, it was straightforward. Locate, track, neutralize. In reality, it was anything but. The network was embedded deep within civilian infrastructure, moving through villages, hiding behind aid convoys, blending in with locals who wanted nothing to do with the fight. Targeting them would mean walking a razor's edge. Jenna was assigned to lead the intelligence team. For months, she lived and breathed the data, supply manifests, shipment patterns, satellite captures. It was a puzzle with 1,000 pieces, and slowly it began to make sense. They were close enough to plan coordinated strikes across multiple regions. But something wasn't adding up. The deeper she dug, the more inconsistencies she found. Communications logs that didn't match known enemy encryption. Supply routes that detoured through government-protected zones. A set of coordinates marked for a strike that showed no evidence of insurgent activity, just a school, a medical clinic, and a handful of homes. At first, Jenna thought it was a mistake, a clerical error, maybe a misread satellite pass, but when she brought it up in the next intel meeting, the room went cold. "Those coordinates are confirmed," said Major Latham, the mission lead. "Confirmed by who?" Jenna asked, scrolling through her data again. "I'm not seeing any signal activity in that sector. No weapons shipments, no personnel movement." "Your job isn't to second-guess field intelligence," Latham said sharply. "It's to support it." "I am supporting it," she replied, voice steady, "by telling you this strike doesn't make sense." Latham stared at her for a long time before leaning back in his chair. "Orders stand. Update the mission plan." The meeting moved on, but Jenna barely heard it. Something was wrong. And now, it wasn't just a gut feeling, it was a certainty. That night she stayed long after the lights in the building had gone dark. Alone with the hum of the servers, she combed through every line of data, every intercepted message, every reconnaissance photo. The more she looked, the clearer it became. The target wasn't what they said it was. It wasn't a weapons hub. It wasn't an insurgent stronghold. It was a refugee resettlement center. She stared at the screen, stomach knotting. If they executed the strike as planned, civilians, dozens of them, would die. Women, children, families who had already lost everything. She tried to breathe, but the air felt thin. She had a choice now, one she'd never faced before. She could follow orders, stay silent, and let the operation proceed. Or she could speak up and risk everything, her career, her reputation, maybe even her freedom. The decision felt impossible, but silence, she realized, was no longer strength. In this case, silence would be complicity. The next morning, she walked into Latham's office with a classified file in hand. "I need this strike pulled," she said without preamble. Latham looked up from his desk, irritation flashing across his face. "We've been over this." "No," Jenna said firmly. "We haven't. That target is a civilian center. If we hit it, we're committing a war crime." The word hung in the air like a grenade. "Watch your tone, specialist," he said coldly. "I have the data to prove it," she pressed. "Signal intercepts, civilian registries, satellite images. If you want me to brief command myself, I will." Latham's jaw tightened. "You're out of line." "Maybe," Jenna said, "but I'm not wrong." There was a long, heavy silence. Then he leaned back, his voice dropping into something more dangerous. "Do you understand the consequences of what you're implying?" "I understand the consequences of doing nothing," she said quietly. When she left his office, she didn't know what would happen. She didn't know if she just ended her career. All she knew was that she couldn't let that strike happen. Hours turned into days. The tension was suffocating. Conversations stopped when she entered the room. Reports that once came to her desk started bypassing her entirely. And though no one said it out loud, she could feel it. She'd crossed a line. Then 3 nights before the scheduled strike, she was summoned to a classified briefing. The room was smaller than usual. Just Latham, a legal officer, and a colonel she'd never met. "The target has been reclassified," the colonel said without emotion. Strike authorization withdrawn pending further review. Jenna's chest loosened for the first time in days. Civilians would live. The mission would be recalibrated. But there was no commendation, no acknowledgement, not even a nod. The colonel dismissed her without another word, and as she walked out of the room, she knew the price of speaking up wasn't over. The fallout was subtle, but it was real. Jenna was quietly reassigned from lead analyst on Iron Vein to secondary support on a less critical operation. Her name stopped appearing on certain distribution lists. Colleagues who once sought her advice avoided eye contact in the hallway. Morales, one of the few who still spoke to her, put it bluntly. "You embarrassed them," he said, "and they don't forget that." "I did my job," Jenna replied. "Yeah," he sighed, "and that's what scares them." It would have been easier to quit, to request a transfer or disappear into civilian life. But Jenna wasn't built to walk away. Not when there were still missions that needed her, still lives that could be saved. So she stayed, quieter than before, more cautious, but still relentless. Months later, a new operation landed on her desk. Codename, Hollow Lantern. This one was different, a deep-cover intelligence mission involving allied forces, multiple agencies, and overlapping jurisdictions. It was messy, political, and dangerous. And almost immediately, Jenna noticed something strange. Data streams were being rerouted before they reached her. Reports arrived with redacted sections that didn't make sense. Pieces of the puzzle were missing, deliberately. She started digging, quietly at first. A few database queries here, a few cross-checks there. But the deeper she went, the clearer it became. Someone was manipulating the intelligence. A logistics report listed shipments that didn't exist. A communications intercept referenced a facility that wasn't on any map. And a surveillance photo, supposedly of an insurgent convoy, was actually 6 months old, from an entirely different region. This wasn't sloppiness, it was sabotage. And whoever was behind it was high enough to cover their tracks. The discovery put Jenna in a dangerous position. If she reported it without proof, she'd be dismissed, maybe even disciplined for insubordination. If she stayed quiet, operations could go catastrophically wrong. So she did what she'd always done. She built the evidence piece by piece. For weeks, she collected anomalies, traced metadata, and reconstructed original reports. Late nights blurred into early mornings. Morales covered for her when she missed check-ins. And slowly, a picture began to form, a picture that pointed to someone inside the chain of command rerouting missions for reasons that had nothing to do with national security. It wasn't about stopping insurgents, it was about controlling resources, contracts, influence, power. When the truth finally crystallized, Jenna sat back in her chair, heart pounding. This wasn't just corruption, it was betrayal that could cost lives. She didn't know who she could trust. Reporting it through normal channels might get her silenced before anyone listened. Going public was out of the question. So she reached out to the one person she knew still believed in her, the field commander from the Black File operation. They met in a quiet cafe off base, away from cameras and prying eyes. She handed him a flash drive across the table. "What's this?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "And if I'm right, we have a bigger problem than any of us realized." He plugged it into a secure tablet, scrolling through the files in silence. Then he looked up, eyes darker than she'd ever seen. "This isn't just sabotage," he said. "This is treason." The days that followed were a blur of briefings, investigations, and closed-door hearings. The evidence Jenna had gathered triggered a full-scale probe. Senior officials were removed, contracts were frozen, and operations that might have gone disastrously wrong were halted before they began. Her name was never mentioned publicly. It couldn't be. Too many reputations were at stake. Too many people wanted this buried. But those who mattered knew. And when the commander passed her in the hallway days later, he didn't speak. He just gave a small, deliberate nod. the kind soldiers gave each other before walking into fire. Late one night, long after the investigation concluded, Jenna sat alone on the edge of her bunk, staring at the dog tags hanging from her fingers. She thought about everything: the strike that never happened, the civilians who lived, the men who died because her warning went unheard. She thought about the system she'd chosen to serve, flawed, messy, sometimes cruel, and the people it protected. And she thought about her father, about how he'd never know the truth of what she'd done, about how he'd probably still introduce her as the one who works at a desk. But maybe that didn't matter anymore. Strength wasn't about medals or titles. It wasn't about who told the loudest story at the bar. Strength was about doing the right thing, even when no one was watching, even when no one would ever know. Especially then. What happens when the mission stops being about the enemy and starts being about you? Jenna had asked herself that question more than once over the past year. Usually, she could push it aside, bury herself in the work, in the data, in the details that kept people breathing. But now, as she stared at the latest classified briefing packet on her desk, she knew there was no avoiding it. This one was different. This one was personal. Operation Glass Veil was unlike anything she'd been part of. It wasn't a typical intelligence-gathering mission or a standard disruption campaign. This was surgical, targeted. The objective: dismantle a clandestine network smuggling advanced weapons across multiple borders. The kicker: the network's logistics arm was being run by a private military contractor based in the United States, one with deep connections to political figures, military brass. And according to preliminary intel, one that had been co-founded by a former Army drill instructor named David Walker. Her father. At first she thought it had to be a mistake. There were plenty of David Walkers in the system. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe the name was just a placeholder. But the deeper she dug into the intel package, the more undeniable it became. The company, Ranger Corps Global, had started 15 years ago with two founders, one of whom was a retired drill sergeant from Texas. The other was a logistics executive with a record of skirting international arms regulations. Her breath caught when she saw the founding documents. There it was, her father's signature, bold, proud. The man who'd spent a lifetime lecturing her about strength and honor was now profiting off a weapons pipeline that had armed both sides of the same conflict. For the first time in her career, Jenna's hands wouldn't stop shaking. The next 48 hours were a blur of sleepless nights and unanswered questions. She read every line of the classified report, cross-referenced financial records, and pieced together the operation's scope. Ranger Corps wasn't just supplying weapons, they were manipulating conflicts, selling arms to sanctioned groups, feeding intelligence to whoever paid most, and they were doing it under the guise of strategic consulting. The fallout, if exposed, would be seismic: military careers destroyed, political alliances shattered, possibly even international trials. And standing at the center of it all was her father. She sat alone in the operations room, long after the last analyst had gone home, the glow of the monitors painting tired shadows across her face. Part of her wanted to believe he didn't know, that he'd signed some documents years ago and had no idea what the company was doing. But deep down, she knew better. Her father wasn't a fool. If anything, he was meticulous. If Ranger Corps had crossed the line, he had either known or chosen not to care. The little girl in her wanted to scream, wanted to storm into his house and demand answers. But the soldier in her, the one who'd spent years saving lives quietly and without thanks, knew this wasn't about family. It was about duty. And duty didn't flinch. The official investigation into Ranger Corps was assigned to a Joint Intelligence Task Force, but Jenna was quietly pulled aside by her commanding officer. "They want you on the analysis team," he said. "Because of my background?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. "Because no one reads patterns like you," he said. "We need to know where the shipments are going, how deep the network runs, and who's funding it. You're the best we've got." The irony wasn't lost on her. The daughter her father once said wouldn't last a week was now being asked to help dismantle his empire. She accepted the assignment. She didn't hesitate. Working the case was like dissecting a living organism. Every thread she pulled revealed another artery, another organ, another vital piece of a machine designed to thrive in darkness. Ranger Corps had subsidiaries on 3 continents, shell companies in 6 countries, and offshore accounts in places most people couldn't find on a map. But the deeper Jenna dug, the more disturbing the truth became. Ranger Corps wasn't just selling weapons. They were actively redirecting them into conflict zones where U.S. troops were deployed, prolonging fights that could have ended months earlier. Every deal, every shipment, every consultation was designed to keep the machine running. And soldiers, men and women who believed they were fighting for something righteous, were dying because of it. The revelation hit her harder than any battlefield casualty report ever had. It wasn't the enemy killing them. It was greed. It was betrayal. It was him. One night, as she was piecing together a particularly convoluted transaction trail, morale stopped by her desk. He'd known something was wrong for weeks. He could see it in the way she worked, in the dark circles under her eyes, in the silence she carried like armor. "You're taking this one personally," he said softly. She didn't look up. "Wouldn't you?" "Yeah," he said, "but I'd also remember that this isn't about him. It's about the people on the ground, the ones counting on us to stop it." She closed her laptop and finally looked at him. "It's hard to separate the two." "Maybe you don't have to," he said. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe this is where it all comes full circle." The task force spent 3 months building the case. Piece by piece, they mapped out the network, where the money flowed, where the weapons went, who profited. By the end, they had enough evidence to justify a multinational raid on Ranger Corps' Central Operations Hub, a fortified logistics compound hidden behind the facade of a humanitarian supply base. Jenna's role was critical. She was tasked with constructing the operational map, predicting enemy response, plotting potential escape routes, anticipating contingencies. It was the most complex mission plan she'd ever built. And at the center of it all was one final piece of intelligence, a list of individuals expected to be on-site during the operation. Her father's name was on it. The night before the mission, Jenna sat alone in her quarters staring at the list. She tried to imagine what it would be like seeing him again for the first time in years, not as her father but as a target. Would he recognize her? Would he try to explain? Would he even care? She didn't know, and maybe she didn't want to. The truth was simple. If he was there, he was part of it. And if he was part of it, he had chosen this path. And Jenna Walker had a job to do. The operation launched at dawn. The assault force moved in fast and hard, armored vehicles breaching the perimeter, drones overhead scanning for movement, tactical teams fanning out across the compound. Jenna watched it all unfold from the command center, headset pressed tight against her ear, voice steady, as she relayed real-time intel to the units on the ground. "North corridor clear," she reported. "Target building ahead, 2 guards on the east entrance." "Copy that," came the reply. "Advancing." Gunfire erupted over the comms. Controlled. Surgical. Within minutes, most of the facility was under control. But the primary command suite, the nerve center of Ranger Corps' operations, was still sealed. "Thermal shows 3 signatures inside," one of the team leaders reported. "1 stationary, 2 mobile." Her pulse quickened. 3 signatures. Her father was supposed to be among them. "Breach in 60 seconds, the commander said. The explosion echoed through her headset, followed by the metallic clang of boots on steel. Then a voice, familiar, older, harder, cut through the static. "Hands where I can see them." Silence, then another voice, quieter, unmistakable. "Do you know who I am?" Jenna closed her eyes. She didn't need a video feed to know. It was him. Yeah, the commander replied coldly. We know exactly who you are. Hours later, the compound was secured, dozens of arrests, thousands of documents seized. The Ranger Corps network, once untouchable, was in ruins. And among the detainees, shackled and silent, was David Walker. Jenna didn't see him in person that day. She couldn't. The thought of standing across from him, of looking into the eyes of the man who had mocked her dreams, dismissed her work, and then profited from the chaos she spent her life trying to prevent, was too much. But when the after-action report landed on her desk, she stared at his name for a long, long time. The news made headlines around the world. Private contractor accused of weapons trafficking. Former Army officer implicated in global arms network. Her father didn't make a statement. Neither did her brothers. The family chat thread, once full of photos, jokes, and military updates, went silent. And Jenna, she went back to work. Because the mission wasn't over. There were still threats to analyze, still convoys to protect, still lives to save. But something inside her shifted, something deep and quiet. For the first time in her life, she felt free from the need for approval, free from the shadow of her father's expectations. He had chosen his path, and she had chosen hers. Weeks later, she received an encrypted message from an unknown sender. It contained a single line. I was wrong. No signature, no apology, no explanation. But she knew. And for the first time in a very long time, Jenna allowed herself a small, tired smile. Because strength wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about proving someone else wrong. It was about staying true to what was right, even when the cost was everything. And in that moment she knew she had done exactly that. How do you keep believing in a system after you've seen how easily it can break? It was a question Jenna Walker carried with her every day after Operation Glass Veil. The takedown of Ranger Corps had shaken more than the world's arms networks. It had shaken her. It wasn't just the betrayal of discovering her father's role. It was the realization that corruption didn't always wear the enemy's uniform. Sometimes it wore medals. Sometimes it spoke with authority. Sometimes it even shared your last name. And yet, she was still here, still logging into secure servers before sunrise, still briefing commanders who would never know her name, still mapping patterns that could mean the difference between life and death. But something had changed. The job that once felt like purpose now felt heavier, colder. It wasn't that she cared less, she cared too much. Every mission briefing carried ghosts now. Every map reminded her of how easily motives could twist. Every intercepted message was a reminder that trust was fragile and often undeserved. Still, she worked, because the mission wasn't about who deserved trust, it was about who needed it. 2 months after the Ranger Corps raid, Jenna was reassigned to a newly formed intelligence unit, Task Force Sentinel. Its mission was simple on paper: root out internal threats and compromised operations. But in reality, it was a labyrinth of politics, secrecy, and danger. They weren't tracking insurgents anymore. They were hunting traitors, people with access, clearance, and power. Her first assignment was code-named White Ghost, an investigation into a series of intelligence leaks that had led to 3 failed raids and 1 deadly ambush. Someone inside the military was feeding information to hostile groups, someone with high-level clearance. The team's first challenge was that the leaks were too clean, too precise. Whoever was responsible knew how intelligence worked, knew how to cover their tracks, plant false leads, erase metadata. They were good, too good. Jenna spent weeks poring over data logs, comm intercepts, and personnel movements. Most of it led nowhere. Then one night, long after everyone else had gone home, she noticed something. A sequence of anomalies buried deep within the transmission logs, subtle timing irregularities that only someone obsessed with patterns would even notice. It was enough to start a thread, and once she pulled it, the entire fabric began to unravel. The evidence pointed to someone close, painfully close. a senior officer within the intelligence community, a man with a sterling record, dozens of commendations, and the trust of nearly every high-ranking official Jenna had ever worked under. His name was Colonel Adrian Pike. She'd briefed him countless times. He praised her work in front of generals. He once called her the future of military intelligence. And now the data said he was a traitor. Jenna stared at the file, numb. It was one thing to catch enemies on the other side of the world. It was another to catch one standing in the same room. She brought her findings to the task force commander. "It's not enough," he said. "We need confirmation." So she dug deeper. Every intercepted call, every encrypted message, every shadow in the logs. And slowly the picture became undeniable. Pike had been selling operational details to a network of foreign proxies, not for ideology, not for revenge, for money. It wasn't the betrayal that made Jenna sick. It was the banality of it. The sting operation to catch him was meticulous. They staged a false operation plan, a fabricated mission with carefully seeded intel. If Pike was the leak, it would surface. If not, the operation would proceed as planned. The leak appeared less than 12 hours later. Pike took the bait. The arrest was swift and silent. No gunfire, no confrontation. Just a man in handcuffs being escorted out of a secure facility while the people he'd betrayed stood in stunned silence. Jenna watched from the observation deck, expression unreadable. Pike turned his head as they let him past, and for a fleeting second their eyes met. "You're better at this than I thought," he said, almost admiringly. "You were never as careful as you believed," she replied. It wasn't triumph she felt. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something colder, the dull ache of knowing the rot ran deeper than anyone wanted to admit. The fallout from the Pike arrest rippled through every level of the intelligence community. Clearances were revoked. Audits were launched. Layers of bureaucracy were torn apart and rebuilt. It was necessary, but it left scars. And through it all, Jenna kept working, because that was what she did. She built order out of chaos. She found clarity in noise. She held the line, even when it felt like the line was crumbling under her feet. But something inside her was shifting. The missions were more dangerous now, the stakes higher, but the victories felt hollow. Every win came with a shadow, another betrayal, another compromise, another reminder that the enemy wasn't always on the other side of the map. And then came the call that changed everything. It was 2:30 when the secure line rang. Jenna was still awake, of course. She hadn't been sleeping much lately. The voice on the other end was one she hadn't heard in years. "Jenna." She froze. It was her brother, Michael. "What's going on?" she asked cautiously. "I didn't know who else to call," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "Dad's not doing well." Her throat tightened. "What do you mean?" "He's been sick for a while, didn't want anyone to know. It's bad now." For a moment she didn't speak. Couldn't. David Walker, the man who had mocked her dreams, dismissed her work, and betrayed everything she believed in, was dying. And he wanted to see her. She almost didn't go. She told herself she was too busy, that the mission mattered more. But in the end, duty took on a different shape. This wasn't about forgiveness or closure. It was about understanding, about facing the man who had shaped her life in ways he'd never understand. The house looked smaller than she remembered. The porch that once felt like a fortress was just wood and nails. Her brothers were already there, stone-faced, silent. And in a dimly lit bedroom at the end of the hall, her father lay hooked up to machines that hummed softly in the dark. He looked older, frailer. The once imposing figure of authority was now a shadow of himself. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, with a voice rougher than she remembered, he said, "You came." "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I wouldn't blame you." The silence stretched, heavy with years of unspoken words. "Was it worth it?" she finally asked. Everything you did, the company, the deals, the lives it cost. He stared at the ceiling for a long time. I told myself that it was for the greater good, that I was providing what others couldn't. And now, he sighed, I think I was just afraid of being irrelevant. Jenna swallowed hard. You were wrong. I know. His eyes met hers then, not with pride, not with defiance, but with something closer to regret. I was wrong about a lot of things, especially you. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to scream to tell him that sorry wasn't enough. But instead she felt nothing, or maybe everything. I don't need your apology, she said softly. I never did. I know, he whispered, but I needed to say it. He passed 2 weeks later. There was no funeral, just a small family gathering, quiet and subdued. Her brothers spoke about his service, his discipline, his legacy. Jenna didn't speak at all. She just stood there, hands clasped behind her back, staring at the folded flag resting on the table. For years, she'd chased a version of herself that might make him proud. Then she'd spent years trying to prove she didn't care. Now, standing in the silence he left behind, she realized she didn't need either. His approval had never defined her. His mistakes didn't define her. She did. After the service, she returned to base and found a small package waiting on her desk. No sender, no return address. Inside was a single item, a compass. Old, scratched, and worn. On the back, a single engraving, "Strength isn't always loud." Her mother's words. Her father's gift. And for the first time in a long time, Jenna let herself cry. Not out of grief, not out of anger, but out of the quiet, complicated truth that sometimes people change too late and sometimes that's still enough. Weeks later, Task Force Sentinel received new orders. A high-stakes mission was underway, one that would require everything Jenna had learned, everything she'd become. It was more dangerous than anything before, with intelligence so fragmented that even the analysts doubted it. But as she stared at the blank map on her screen, compass in hand, she felt something she hadn't felt in months: clarity. This wasn't about betrayal anymore. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It wasn't even about redemption. It was about service, the kind that didn't make headlines, that didn't win medals, that didn't need applause. The kind that spoke in whispers, saved lives in silence, and left the world a little less chaotic than it had been before. And that, she realized, was enough. How much can one person carry before they break? It was a question Jenna had never dared to ask herself. She wasn't built to break, at least that's what everyone believed. The ghost with the maps. The last quiet leader. The one who saw everything coming before anyone else did. But strength wasn't invincibility. And lately, as the weight of every mission, every decision, every life saved or lost pressed heavier on her shoulders, Jenna wondered if she was nearing her limit. The new operation, codenamed Silent Current, was unlike anything Task Force Sentinel had attempted. Intelligence suggested a rogue state was preparing a coordinated assault on Allied infrastructure across multiple continents, cyber, physical, and logistical. The scale was unprecedented. And worse, the enemy wasn't a single cell or commander. It was a coalition, several networks uniting for one catastrophic strike. If they succeeded, power grids would fail. Communications would collapse. Civilian life, as millions knew it, would grind to a halt. The chaos wouldn't be contained to one battlefield. It would ripple across borders, destabilizing entire nations. The mission was simple to describe, but nearly impossible to execute. Stop them before they moved. The first obstacle was the lack of actionable intelligence. Nothing about the networks made sense. Their messages were fragmented. Their movements were erratic. Their funding streams appeared from nowhere and vanished without a trace. It was chaos, the kind of chaos that normally meant a dozen dead ends. But Jenna had learned long ago that chaos always hit a pattern. Always. She started from the edges, small, insignificant details that most analysts would ignore. A late-night fuel shipment in a desert town that had no reason to receive one. A courier who changed routes every Tuesday, but only in even-numbered weeks. A brief radio silence between two known operatives that coincided perfectly with a local holiday in a country they weren't even operating in. Each fragment meant nothing on its own, but together they whispered a story. "They're sinking," Jenna told the team during the second-week briefing. "They're aligning their operations around a central timetable, something big enough to coordinate all of this." Her superior frowned. "You're basing this on pattern recognition and timing anomalies." "Yes," Jenna said calmly. "And if I'm right, their window to launch is 6 weeks, maybe less." Silence followed, then a single nod. "Then we move fast." For the next month, Jenna barely slept. She lived on caffeine and adrenaline, buried in a sea of data that stretched from encrypted servers to handwritten courier logs. Every time she found a new connection, it unraveled 2 more. Every time she solved one part of the puzzle, the enemy shifted the board. But little by little, the picture came into focus. The coalition was planning a 3-phase assault. Phase 1, coordinated cyber attacks on energy grids and air traffic control systems. Phase 2, sabotage of major shipping routes to disrupt supply chains. Phase 3, the most devastating simultaneous bombings in multiple capitals to sow panic while the world was still reeling. It was bold, ruthless, and terrifyingly effective. But the most chilling part wasn't the plan, it was who was behind it. The architect of the operation was known only by a code name, Silas. No photo, no nationality, no confirmed sightings. But according to intelligence chatter, he had a reputation for one thing: he never failed. Jenna had never believed in ghosts, but Silas was as close as they came. As the mission accelerated, so did the stakes. The more they learned, the more dangerous the work became. One morning, Jenna arrived at the base to find 2 of her analysts missing. Hours later, news broke that their convoy had been ambushed en route to a secure site. Both were dead. The official line was random attack. Jenna didn't believe it. Silas knew they were getting close. The losses cut deep. These weren't just names on a roster. They were people she'd mentored, laughed with, relied on. Their deaths weren't supposed to happen here, not behind the front lines. And for the first time since she joined the service, Jenna felt fear creep into her work, not fear for herself, but fear of failing them. "You can't stop," Morales said quietly one night, finding her hunched over her desk long after midnight. "I know," she whispered. "They'd want you to finish this." "I know." But knowing didn't make it easier. The breakthrough came 3 weeks before the expected attack window. Jenna was reviewing shipment logs from a remote port when she noticed something odd: containers marked as humanitarian aid routed through a series of obscure holding stations, all controlled by shell companies linked to a single offshore account. The account was registered under the name S. Caro. Caro, as in Silas Caro, a name that had surfaced only once in decades of intelligence chatter, and never with any verifiable link. Until now. She traced the account's transactions, weapons purchases, cyber hardware, black market explosives. Every major component of the planned assault was flowing through one node, a single location. And it was moving. "They're consolidating," she told the operations chief. "Everything's converging on one facility in Eastern Europe. If we hit that node, we cripple the entire operation." The room buzzed with urgency. Plans were drafted, teams mobilized. The strike was set for 300 local time, a joint operation involving special forces, cyber units, and air support. And at the center of it all, Jenna's intelligence. The night before the mission, Jenna sat alone on the base rooftop, the cold wind biting against her skin. Below her, the city glowed with the quiet indifference of a world unaware of how close it had come to disaster. She thought about everything: the missions, the betrayals, the sacrifices. She thought about the friends she'd lost and the enemies she'd outsmarted. She thought about her father and the compass that now lived in her pocket. Mostly, she thought about what would happen if she was wrong. It was the question she always asked before a major operation. And no matter how much experience she had, the fear never left. Because if she was wrong, if the intel was off, if the timing was miscalculated, people would die. And this time they wouldn't just be soldiers, they'd be civilians. Thousands of them. Walker Morale's voice broke her thoughts. He stepped onto the rooftop, hands in his jacket pockets. "You good?" She smiled faintly. "Define good." He sat beside her. "You ever think about what it costs, all this?" "Every day. And you still keep doing it." She stared out at the lights, because someone has to. At 2:35, the operation began. Drone footage streamed across Jenna's screen as the strike team closed in on the facility. Everything was unfolding according to plan, perimeter secured, comms jammed, cyber breaches initiated. But then, something shifted. Thermal shows no weapon signatures, an operator reported. No vehicles, no armed personnel. Jenna's heart skipped. That's not possible, they were here. Negative, this place is empty. Empty. She scanned the feeds again, pulling up every satellite image, every intercept. Nothing. It was a ghost site, a decoy. "Abort exfil," she ordered. "It's a diversion there." Her words were cut off by an urgent transmission from the European Command Center. Multiple explosions reported in Warsaw. Repeat, multiple explosions. Then another, and another, Paris, Berlin, Istanbul. Her blood ran cold. Silas had outplayed them. The hours that followed were chaos. Emergency response channels flooded with distress calls, hospitals overwhelmed, borders sealed, entire cities plunged into panic. The coalition hadn't needed a central hub. They decentralized smaller cells, autonomous and untraceable, moving independently under one master plan. The strike had been a trap, a way to draw resources away from where they were truly needed. Jenna stared at the screens, the devastation unfolding in real time. She felt hollow, numb. Every decision she'd made, every pattern she'd followed had led them here. "I failed," she whispered. "No," Morale said firmly, gripping her shoulder. "They hid too well. Anyone could have missed it." "Anyone didn't," she snapped. "I did." The guilt was suffocating. It pressed on her chest until breathing felt impossible. All those lives gone, all that trust broken. For the first time in her career, Jenna wanted to walk away. But she didn't. Because that wasn't who she was. 2 days later, as the world reeled from the coordinated attacks, Jenna was back at her desk. Eyes bloodshot, hands shaking, heart heavy but there. And when the post-incident review began, she didn't hide from it. She stood before the panel, laid out every decision, every error, every assumption. She didn't make excuses. She didn't deflect blame. "This was on me," she said quietly, "and I intend to fix it." One of the generals, a man known for his impatience, studied her for a long moment. "And how do you propose to do that?" "By finding him," she replied. "By finding Silas, and by ending this." The mission changed after that. It was no longer about stopping an operation. It was about him. Silas wasn't just a name anymore. He was a ghost haunting every report, every intercept, every late-night briefing. And Jenna had made it her purpose to hunt him down. The hunt consumed her. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Leads appeared and vanished. Decoys were planted and exposed. Every time she got close, he slipped through her fingers like smoke, but she kept going. Because this wasn't about redemption anymore. It was about responsibility. And she would carry that weight for as long as it took. One night, deep into the 3rd month of the investigation, a new transmission appeared. Encrypted, fragmented, and unsigned, but unmistakably Sila's. It wasn't a threat, it wasn't a demand. It was a message. "You're closer than you think." Jenna stared at the screen, pulse steady, resolve harder than it had ever been. For the first time, she didn't feel like the hunted. She felt like the hunter. How far would you go for redemption? It was a question Jenna had stopped asking months ago. Redemption wasn't a goal anymore. It was an instinct, a reflex, something buried deep in her bones that pulled her forward even when the rest of her wanted to stop. Because this wasn't about her reputation or her career or even the names of the people she'd lost. It was about Sila's. And Sila's had to be stopped. For 3 months, Jenna had chased shadows. Every clue she found evaporated just before she could grasp it. Every lead turned into smoke. Every carefully constructed theory unraveled with a single unexpected move. He was playing a different game, a long game, and she was learning it piece by piece. But now, finally, the pieces were falling into place. It started with a coded message buried deep in a civilian communications channel, a series of random numbers and symbols that most analysts ignored. But Jenna didn't believe in coincidences. She decrypted it, layer by layer, and what emerged was a breadcrumb trail, not a message, but a pattern. A pattern that pointed to a single location, a remote facility in the mountains of northern Norway. On paper, it was a weather research station. In reality, it was a data relay hub, and according to the fragments she had pieced together, it was the final link in Silas's network, the nerve center that connected his scattered cells around the globe. Take that hub offline, and his empire would collapse. Leave it standing, and he would keep slipping through the cracks. The operation, codenamed Iron Wraith, was approved within days. But unlike every mission before, Jenna wasn't just on the planning team. She was embedded with the Forward Intelligence Unit. This wasn't about sitting behind a screen anymore. This time, she was going to see it through. "Are you sure about this?" Morales asked as they reviewed the final plans in the command tent. "No," she admitted, "but I'm done watching from the sidelines." He studied her for a long moment. "Then let's finish it." The team inserted under the cover of a snowstorm, a small surgical strike force of 12, moving silently through the frozen terrain. The plan was simple: breach the facility, extract data, destroy the relay systems, and capture any key personnel before exfiltration. Jenna's role was to guide them through the maze of security systems and coordinate real-time intelligence from a forward operations post set up just a kilometer away. It was closer to the action than she'd ever been. "Signal check." The commander's voice crackled through her earpiece as the team approached the perimeter. "Reading you 5 by 5, Jenna replied, fingers dancing over the keyboard as she bypassed the first layer of digital defenses. "Security grid offline in 3, 2, 1. You're clear." They moved like ghosts through the snow, quiet, precise, unstoppable. But Jenna knew better than anyone that Sila's wouldn't make it easy. There would be traps. There always were. "Thermals show 2 heat signatures near the east corridor," she said. "Probably guards. Recommend silent takedown." "Copy that." Moments later, the feed showed both targets down without a sound. Everything was going according to plan. Until it was. The breach team was 20 meters from the relay core when the alarms erupted. "Tripwire," someone shouted over comms. "We've been made." Jenna's screen exploded with activity, systems locking down, automated defenses activating, communications frequencies jamming one by one. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, controlled. "He's here," she whispered. "What?" Morales asked. "Sila's, he's here. He's watching us." "Walker, we need a new route," the commander barked. "Doors are sealed." Jenna's mind raced. She scanned the schematics, cross-referenced ventilation shafts, maintenance tunnels, any possible ingress point. Then she saw it, an unused utility passage beneath the relay chamber. It was narrow, risky, and likely trapped, but it was their only shot. "Sending you coordinates," she said. "Move fast, they're trying to box you in." The team shifted course, navigating through the tight, claustrophobic tunnel system beneath the facility. The sound of distant gunfire echoed through their comms as hostiles closed in. "Contact rear," someone shouted. "3 down, we're pinned." "Hold position," Jenna ordered. "Rerouting you a flank corridor, 60 meters northeast, go now." They moved again, firing, silence, then firing again. It was chaos, but controlled chaos. And through it all, Jenna was the calm center, guiding them through the storm one step at a time. Then came the voice. "Clever work, Specialist Walker," the transmission said, calm, almost amused. "But cleverness only gets you so far." It was Sila's. Jenna froze. "How did you get on this channel?" "Oh, I've been here all along," he replied. "It's been fascinating watching you chase me, all those sleepless nights, all that guilt. Tell me, do you think you're saving the world, or just trying to forgive yourself?" Her breath hitched. He knew. Somehow he knew. "This ends today," she said coldly. "Oh, I agree," Silas replied, "but not the way you think." The transmission cut out. Her heart pounded. This was no longer just an operation. It was a duel, and she was playing on his board now. The team reached the relay core minutes later, a cathedral of blinking servers and humming processors, the beating heart of Silas's empire. But something was wrong. Too quiet, too still. "Negative contact," the commander reported. "No hostiles inside." That's when Jenna saw it, a secondary signal buried deep within the relay's power grid. A countdown. "Oh God," she whispered, "it's rigged." "How bad?" Morales asked. "Catastrophic. He's wired the core with a failsafe. If it blows, it takes the facility and everything within 2 kilometers with it." "How long do we have?" 7 minutes. Panic rippled through the comms. 7 minutes. Too short for an evacuation. Too short to defuse manually. But Jenna wasn't about to let this end with a crater. "Patch me into the grid," she said. "I'm going in." "Walker, it's too dangerous," Morales warned. "So is doing nothing." She dove into the system, fingers flying across the keyboard as she bypassed layer after layer of encryption. Silas had designed it well, elegant, brutal code that fought back with every keystroke, but she was better. She had to be. 5 minutes, the commander reported. "What's our play?" "Still working," Jenna muttered. "He's rerouting through secondary nodes, damn it, he's anticipating me." 4 minutes. Sweat dripped down her temple, her hands shook. She was so close, one more layer, one more bypass. 3 minutes. "Got it," she shouted. "Manual override unlocked, but someone has to pull it from inside the core chamber." "On it," the commander said. "No," Jenna interrupted. "It has to be me." "What?" "If we miscalculate the sequence, the system relocks. I need real-time access." "Walker, you're not trained for field." "Neither was anyone who died because of me." Silence, then, "Copy, moving you in." The core chamber was colder than she expected, a metallic heart pulsing with deadly energy. The countdown blared on the central console. 2, 14, 2, 13. "Talk me through it," Morales said over comms. "Bypass the main relay, isolate the secondary charge, reroute the fail-safe loop," she said, her hands flying from one panel to the next. "If I can cut the feedback, we can neutralize the detonation cascade." English Jenna. "Cut the wire before the bomb explodes," she muttered. "Better." 60 seconds, the commander warned. Jenna's breath was shallow now, her pulse pounding in her ears. Every second felt like an eternity. Her fingers hovered over the final sequence. One wrong move and it was over. 30 seconds. "Come on, come on." 20. A final keystroke, a surge of power. The countdown froze at 00:19. Then it reset. "No," she gasped. "He locked a failsafe behind the failsafe. We missed something." 10 seconds. "Walker." Almost. 9. Bypassing secondary conduit. 8. Redirecting loop circuit. 7. Manual override engaged. 6. Come on. 5. Come on. 4. A blinding flash, then silence. The explosion never came. The timer froze at 0001. Detonation neutralized, Jenna breathed, collapsing against the console. Cheers erupted over the comms. The team secured the facility. The relay was offline. Silas's network, his empire, was shattered. But Silas himself was gone. In the weeks that followed, the world slowly began to heal. The cells that once acted with surgical precision now stumbled in disarray. Funding dried up. Communications collapsed. The threat that had loomed for years was finally fading. But the man behind it, the ghost Jenna had hunted, was still out there. Some said he'd been killed in the chaos. Others believed he'd gone underground, planning his next move. But Jenna knew the truth. He was alive. And one day he'd resurface. Months later, during a quiet evening at the base, she found a small envelope waiting on her desk. No return address. Inside, a single piece of paper. You are closer than you think. She stared at it for a long time. Then she smiled, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with a quiet, steady resolve. This wasn't over. Maybe it never would be. But that was the nature of her work. It wasn't about winning once and walking away. It was about showing up, day after day, year after year, and doing the hard, thankless work that kept the world from falling apart. Weeks later, she stood before a new batch of recruits, young, eager, and wide-eyed. Most of them would never know her name. Most would never understand what she had done. And that was exactly how it was supposed to be. Strength, she told them softly, isn't always loud. It isn't always visible. It isn't always the one holding the weapon. Sometimes it's the one who sees the danger before it comes. Sometimes it's the one who makes sure the fight never reaches your doorstep. They listened in silence, some nodding, some just watching her carefully. Your job, she said, isn't to be seen. It's to make sure others live. That night, Jenna walked alone down the quiet corridor of the operations wing. The air was cool, the lights dim, and as she passed the heavy steel doors of the briefing room, she heard two soft knocks against the frame. A signal, the same one they'd used all those years ago before stepping into danger. A silent way of saying, "We trust you." She smiled faintly. Then she turned and walked toward the sound, steady and unhurried. Because the mission wasn't over, it never really was. And in a world that shouted about power, she had learned the most important truth of all. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.